Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining me on this second of our two-part series looking at UNDRIP and its implementation into Canadian law. We'll start this part by looking at Canada's ever-evolving position on UNDRIP. We'll then move to look at the core elements of Canada's UNDRIP implementation law, followed by a discussion of the challenges of implementing UNDRIP into Canada. Lastly, we're going to have a discussion about the ways that we can promote UNDRIP and its implementation in the things that we do and in the communities that we live. So, with that, let's begin. Canada's ever-evolving position on UNDRIP. As discussed in part 1 of this video together, UNDRIP rights go above and beyond existing Canadian law in terms of recognizing Indigenous rights. But to be clear, UNDRIP does not create more or better standards for international human rights for Indigenous peoples than it does for all others. What it does is it looks at human rights that are already protected under international law, and it clarifies that those rights also apply to Indigenous peoples. Even though that should be obvious and completely unnecessary, history tells us otherwise, as there is a long history in both international and Canadian law denying Indigenous peoples basic human rights that are afforded to everyone else. So UNDRIP says Indigenous peoples have the same individual human rights as everyone else on the planet. And it also does one thing more than that. The Declaration describes distinct collective or shared rights of the group that Indigenous peoples alone uniquely hold, such as the right to their culture and lands. Indigenous peoples are the only ones who have these rights because of their prior and first occupancy over their lands and territories. This makes it clear that Indigenous peoples are not a problem to be solved, a risk to be minimized, or a burden to be removed, but right holders to be respected. And that goes further than Canadian law has consistently been willing to do. And this slide helps explain some of that inconsistency by Canadian law. See, this is a timeline of how the Declaration came to be from when Indigenous peoples first wrote it all the way to the present day. And I'm sorry that it's impossible to read, but that's what 40 years of struggle will do. And that huge timeline shows how hard it was to get the world to agree that Indigenous peoples had the same basic rights as all other free people, including the basic right as the first occupants to their lands to be self-determining over their own territories. So on the far left of this timeline, you can see that even though the work on the Declaration began in the 70s and 80s, and a draft was mostly finished by 1995, it wasn't actually approved by the United Nations until 2007, and that was even following significant concessions and compromises being made, including the introduction of Article 46, or the last article. Article 46 was the result of a significant back and forth in order to get consensus, or at least near consensus, support of the world's nations for the Declaration. Article 46 was contentious, specifically subsection 2, but the entire article wasn't a part of the consensus that was drafted by Indigenous peoples. Instead, it was added by nation states. Essentially, Article 46 acts as a limitations clause to the rights under the Declaration. In this way, it's similar to how the notwithstanding clause limits charter rights under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and it does this by expressly contemplating that qualifications to UNDRIP rights will be necessary where they intersect or potentially conflict with other rights or requirements of a democratic society. What this means is that a balancing exercise can be applied to UNDRIP rights where they interfere with other societal rights. States said the reason that they needed this was to protect state integrity or to stop the formation or splintering of nation states as a result of UNDRIP being used by Indigenous peoples to secede from the larger public body. But subsection 1 largely takes care of that, so it's clear that nation states wanted more because subsection 2 of Article 46 does do more there. However, those who say that the article serves to make UNDRIP meaningless or weakens it in some detrimental way forget that no right in society is absolute. That is, there's always a need to balance rights, and Article 46 even goes further with subsection 3 stating that the balancing process needs to be done in good faith and with fairness. So at the end of the day, Article 46 just says something that applies to all rights. That is, that even UNDRIP rights are not absolute and must be weighed against other societal rights, including the rights of other people. So from a legal point of view, this would have happened with or without Article 46, and it could be argued that the fact that Article 46 recognizes the need for this balance of rights strengthens UNDRIP by making it more clearly translatable into workable law. And translatable to law are words that I want to focus on for a moment, because we need to remember what UNDRIP is and what it isn't. As an international declaration, it is a type of international statement, not law. The United Nations uses declarations when it wants to say something about important matters where maximum compliance is expected, but not required. This means that the International Declaration isn't a treaty, a covenant, or a protocol, and you don't need to know the difference between all those types of legal instruments except to know that what it means legally is that the declaration is not enforceable. It is not binding, as we say at law. That means that you can't force states to comply with it. It merely informs states about what they should do, not what they must do. However, the declaration is a statement by the entire United Nations on the expected minimum standards for Indigenous peoples. This means that it provides a floor for respecting Indigenous rights, not the ceiling, meaning countries can, of course, go above or take actions beyond the declaration standards, but they shouldn't go below them, lest they be at a minimum named and shamed. However, again, you notice that I said the words shouldn't, not that they can't. And the reason for that is, again, intentional, because the declaration is not a law. It's less. But in case that has you worried that maybe the declaration isn't so important and maybe this isn't an important use of our time to be looking at it so much, remember these two things. One, the declaration is not a statement from merely you or me, but from the world government. Or the General Assembly of the United Nations, the world's parliament, and that has power. And two, we're here to discuss more than just the international declaration. We're also here to discuss the new federal Canadian law that makes the declaration part of our domestic laws. And that is to say that the roots of the declaration have since expanded from the international to the national stage, and that matters a great deal from a legal standpoint. So because of that, I get to skip over this slide and this discussion about, how the law at international levels can be divided between binding or hard law and soft law. And I'm glad that I do, because this is a very confusing conversation, even for lawyers. More at the end of the day, whether hard or soft law, generally, international law works more through moral persuasion than it does through the direct use of force. This is because regardless of whether the international law is technically hard or soft law, the reality is that unlike domestic governments, the world government doesn't have a police force or a way to punish those who break its laws, at least not in the way that you and I usually think of laws being enforced through police, courts, judges, prisons, jails. Far more useful than talking about the reception or adoption of international law through customs or norms is talking about whether or not a country has passed its own law to make that international law the law in its country. And that's why Canada's United Nations Declaration Act is so important, because that's exactly what Canada did. So now let's talk about Canada's new law for bringing the United Nations Declaration home and why it is that that law matters so much. The short version of this slide is that Canada didn't sign the declaration right away, and then it changed its mind a lot before even endorsing it internationally or taking any steps to put it into domestic laws. It was hard to keep track of Canada's position about the declaration until very recently. As you know, Canada was one of the only countries who voted against it in 2007. Later in 2010, when Stephen Harper was prime minister, Canada said it supported it, but it was only aspirational and had no legal weight. Then, when the Liberals won election in 2016, they said they fully supported it and they would make sure that it was part of Canadian law. But not really, because despite being in power since 2016, Only after the most recent 2019 election did the Liberals keep their promise to bring in legislation to make the declaration binding in Canada. Now, there's a lot to discuss in terms of background on this, but the short version is that Canada did finally be an UNDRIP law forward, but not until after other jurisdictions, such as British Columbia, brought in their own UNDRIP implementation law in 2019. But when Canada did do it, it was done through Bill C-15, which became law a little over a year ago. And that was the result of limited co-drafting with First Nations and limited engagement, since it was created during the heights of COVID. But because of Canada's back and forth on supporting UNDRIP, there remain a lot of questions about how exactly the law is going to be implemented into Canada's laws. So let's begin by talking about Canada's Act for implementing UNDRIP. And I'll start by talking about what that act doesn't do. What the declaration law does not do is directly implement the international declaration. What I mean by that is it doesn't make the declaration's standards and the rights in the declaration instantly the law of Canada overnight. It doesn't by proclamation immediately overturn or declare any aspects of existing Canadian law that aren't compliant with the declaration to be invalid or null. Instead, it tells Canada's federal government that it needs to look at all of its laws to ensure that they are in harmony with the declaration, and that means they have to go through a very thorough internal review process, a review process that needs to be done with the help of Indigenous peoples. And the Act has 3 core tools for making the declaration the law in Canada. First is an action plan to implement the objectives of the declaration without delay. Second, the Canadian government must take all steps necessary to ensure that Canadian laws are in harmony with the declaration by working with Indigenous peoples and figuring out from them which laws need to be changed and how. And third, the Crown must give Parliament an update every year on how its work of bringing Canada's laws into alignment with the declaration is progressing. It's important to note at this stage that this process only works for federal laws, not for territorial or provincial laws. So, for example, the Northwest Territories government would have to make and pass its own declaration law if it wanted to start a formal process of bringing all of its laws up to the declaration standards. We can see from this that Canada's approach under the declaration law will be to have their laws slowly changed over time, not right away. It's important, though, because we need to remember that Canada's law, in backing the declaration this way, shows support for these Indigenous rights to become a part of Canadian law, even if made subject to a gradual and incremental process. Even though this act could perhaps do more to get the declaration into Canadian law faster and harder, I think it's important to remember that before we criticize it too much, that the rights in the declaration might not have been put into Canadian law in any way other than slowly and piecemeal through international agreements if it was not for this law. So if we look now at some of the key challenges and considerations in implementing the declarations, what we see is that this partnered implementation process with Indigenous peoples presents both an opportunity and a risk. It is a chance to find and rank the Canadian laws that Indigenous peoples think need to be replaced or changed to meet UNDRIP standards, and that's a plus. However, considering the short time frame that's involved in getting this first action plan, it's concerning if Canada takes a pan-Indigenous approach to this process. So if they don't take into account the different voices, laws, and jurisdictions of Indigenous peoples in a proper way, we need to keep in mind that there are 644 different First Nation communities in Canada. That doesn't even include the Inuit and Métis in that number. So for the declaration to be put into action, everyone will have to do their part. And to do that properly, it's going to take time and resources. Another thing to keep in mind is that First Nations around the country won't all have the same priorities. For example, my clients in the Northwest Territories don't have the same priorities as those in British Columbia or Ontario, for instance. So my clients in British Columbia or Ontario or the southern regions of the country, that use primarily a reserve system instead of modern treaties, often they want the Indian Act or acts that are linked to the Indian Act to be changed as soon as possible through the action plan. But the Indian Act is much less important in the North, as you know, where modern treaties are more common and where the promises in old peace and friendship treaties about making reservations were never kept. So when laws need to be changed, people in the North often have very different ideas about what should come first than people in the South. And so how the action plan making process navigates these issues will be extremely important. And this makes me think primarily to procedural observations for the action plan at this stage. So we really need to get a better sense of how Canada proposes to consult and collaborate with Indigenous peoples. Do they have to accept what Indigenous peoples suggest for the action plans? Who gets the last say in these instances? Those details have not been fleshed out at this point. And over the next year, Canada is going to ask people from all over the country what changes to key laws should be made first. And in less time than that, so 9 or 10 months from now, that process will be done and we will have our first action plan. So we obviously have very little time to be thinking about a list of laws that are important to us that need to be updated. But my first thoughts go further than just identifying the laws. I think for this work to move forward, not only is a lot more time and resources going to be needed, decolonizing Canadian laws to make room for Indigenous laws is a massive project. But ultimately, since that process will take decades, we need to not only focus on which specific pieces of Canadian legislation need to be changed at this stage to be brought up to UNDRIP standards, but also to lay out a structured process for ensuring that the action plan and future action plans are done in a way that is truly in partnership with Indigenous peoples, because that's one of the biggest promises that exists in Canada's UNDRIP implementation law is the partnership process. So the key takeaway for me is probably that the full alignment of Canada's laws with the Declaration's rights, it's generational work. Implementing it will be a process, not an event. It will be achieved over a long journey, not in leaps and bounds. So hence my use of the tortoise and hare here on these slides, because doing it right will take time. And that might miss the expectations of some who want to see transformative change right away. But if it's done right, it has the potential to change how Indigenous and non-Indigenous governments work together, and ultimately how reconciliation itself unfolds overall. And that is a huge opportunity. So instead of thinking of this process as the end, I think that it's more productive to think of the UNDRIP law as the beginning of something big that will help Indigenous people's rights move forward. And this message of tamping down on initial expectations is one that seems to be shared on all sides of the aisle. So this quote is from the Canadian Department of Justice's website, and you'll see that, this quote is, and you'll see that that quote is very similar to the one by former Assembly First Nations Chief Phil Fontaine. So basically, they're both Indigenous governmental leaders. Canadian governmental leaders are both basically saying the same thing, that this is the beginning of a process, not the end. And so preparing everyone for the long road ahead we have of decolonizing Canadian law. The future path and the do-it-yourself approach to UNDRIP. This is the final section of this presentation and a critical piece. We need to remember that UNDRIP itself came from Indigenous peoples and their leadership, not from countries. And the same will apply when it comes to seeing through Canada's UNDRIP implementation law. FPIC, or free, prior, and informed consent, is of course an important aspect of the Declaration. It's not just one right in one part of the Declaration, but instead is found throughout the Declaration's rights. And while it's definitely the elephant or gorilla in the room whenever you talk about the Declaration, it's actually not that complicated. And a very straightforward explanation of this aspect of the Declaration is simply that it becomes a legal tool for returning to treaty making together in how Canada and Indigenous peoples work with one another. See, consent is far from new. It's in fact the way that Indigenous peoples and the Crown began their interactions and relationship with one another. It's also not rare at all today, as it's increasingly the norm in how First Nations and industry engage with one another on extractive resource projects all across the country. More consent circumstances exist under both existing constitutional law and within the Declaration. But in neither case is consent categorical or absolute across the board. Instead, it's a spectrum analysis based on the right that's at risk and the impact that's involved. So then, one often asks, if consent doesn't always mean the final authority to say yes or no, how does UNDRIP provide so much more than the current Canadian law? And the answer is that FPIC does this because it makes the clear objective in getting together is always to obtain consent. It's never merely to consult or get input or feedback. And this is true even where actual consent being obtained at the end of the process itself is not required at the end of the day. And it still matters. And the reason that it matters is because the way you do something, how you begin it, has a fundamental impact on both what you end up determining and where it is that you end up. And if Indigenous peoples and the Canadian government begin from a position of true nation-to-nation relations, they are far more likely to see a fruitful and fair result at the end of the day. And this is part of the promise of UNDRIP, because operationalizing consent will be the implementation flashpoint on UNDRIP implementation issues going forward. And if I could select one key benchmark for progress, one thing where we could look and say, hey, here's an indicator that we're making real progress on the Declaration's implementation, it would be around the issues of free, prior, and informed consent. It would be all about consent. And if we could just drop the FPIC language and just call it what it is, which is negotiation, because it basically just means that the Crown needs to move away from consultation and move towards negotiation to seek the agreement of Indigenous peoples before they make a decision or take any action that has an impact upon Indigenous peoples' rights. And seeking permission of Indigenous peoples first, becoming the starting point, is again not that very far from where we began in our relationship with one another. So if we can get back to the point where that is what is being done and is required by government, then I think we will really be able to say that we've made progress, not just on implementing the Declaration, but on also moving forward with meaningful reconciliation. Because seeking consent will include the room for shared decision making and the shared space for both Indigenous and federal laws to operate at the same time. And this would be very similar to how federal and provincial governments interact with one another today, where they cooperate as distinct but separate orders of government, and they seek to negotiate with one another within the spheres of their power and jurisdiction as governing partners. And the best way for Indigenous peoples to push that forward is to make UNDRIP's standards and its consent-oriented processes mainstream. And you can do that by building them in to everything that the community government does. So wherever it can, however it can, whether through protocols, First Nation licenses, permits, Indigenous legal orders, even where self-asserted, all of these things help to promote and push forward the implementation of UNDRIP. And I'll close by saying that this do-it-yourself approach to the Declaration's implementation, it doesn't have to just occur at the First Nation level, but can also apply to some extent, even at the individual one, because you can continue to learn about the Declaration to spread its rights framework and push for self-determination and the space for Indigenous laws and systems in a whole variety of areas. Because if Indigenous peoples hold fast, they can help ensure that self-determination is realized and protected, and the Implementation Act that Canada introduced is one tool for seeing that process through. Because without Indigenous leadership and guidance, there becomes the risk that Canada defines how UNDRIP standards are met, and they may define it in a way that fails to fulfill UNDRIP's promise without proper Indigenous leadership and oversight. And I'll make that my closing thought for this presentation. So thank you for listening and for watching, and please feel free to contact me directly with any questions that you may have. I look forward to our continued work together on making UNDRIP and the recognition and protection of Indigenous rights a reality here in Canada. Masicho.
Now